Leviticus chapter 25. Work hard, rest well, stay free, part 2. 2 weeks ago, in the first 24 verses, we looked at the sabbatical year. We looked at the year of Jubilee. And this week, we're going to be looking at the law of the redeeming relative. So let's begin reading at verse 25. If one of your brethren, that would be a Jew, becomes poor and has sold some of his possession, and if his redeeming relative, a close family member, comes to redeem it, then he may redeem what his brother, his fellow Jew, has sold. Verse 26, or if the man has no one to redeem it, but he himself becomes able to redeem it, so he did fall on hard times. He had to sell stuff off, but his bottom line has changed, so his outlook financially has changed. He has recovered, and now he wants to buy back his own possession. Verse 27, then let him count the years since its sale and restore the remainder to the man to whom he sold it, that he may return to his possession. And again, that is adjusting the payback based on the intrinsic value of what was leased, and also the factoring in the number of years that it was possessed and the number of years remaining on that lease. Verse 28, but if he is not able to have it restored to himself, then what was sold shall remain in the hand of him who bought it until the year of Jubilee, and in the Jubilee every 50 years it shall be released, and he shall return to his possession. He gets it back at that time. That is the introduction to the law of the redeeming relative, as it's called in the New King James Version. The kinsman redeemer in the King James Version, it is the Hebrew word goel in the original. It is a real simple law, very straightforward, very clear-cut, and easy for us to understand. It is a law where a close family member was allowed to step in for a family member that had sold off possessions or people even within the family into slavery or property, and that close family member could step in and pay the price to buy back, to redeem. That's what redeem means, right? To buy back that possession for that family member. Obviously, if they sold it, it was because they hit hard times. It just wasn't a thing for people to go around selling land and houses and valuable possessions unless it was absolutely financially crucial that they do so in order to stay afloat. Now, the chapter is going to finish up on this topic of the goel, the redeeming relative, and it's going to give us more information on this subject. So what we're going to do is we're going to wait until we get to the end of this chapter to really discuss the full scope of these laws for the redeeming relative, the goel. And for now, I would like us to move on to verse 29, where the Lord now is going to add an exception to all of these laws of redemption. There is an exception. Verse 29, if a man sells a house in a walled city, then he may redeem it within a whole year after it's sold. Within a full year, he may redeem it so long as he has his receipt. This is not Walmart. This is Israel. You have to have your receipt. You can get away with that at Walmart, but not here. You need to have a record of this. And if you can make that payment back within that year, A-okay, go for it. Verse 30, but if it is not redeemed within the space of a full year, then the house in the walled city shall belong permanently to him who bought it throughout his generations. It shall not be released in the Jubilee. So this is the one exception to all of these laws about redemption. If the house that you sold was located within the walls of a city, you only had 1 full year to buy that house back, to redeem that house back. That included having a redeeming relative step in to buy back that house for you. And if you couldn't get it done in that year, if you couldn't meet that deadline, even with the help of a redeeming relative, then that was a permanent sale. You lost that house permanently. Even the year of Jubilee wouldn't affect the movement of that home. It was a permanent sale that would remain with the new owner indefinitely. Now, likely the reason for that is because the city of Jerusalem is going to be a walled city. And those houses within the city of Jerusalem, they're going to have to be stacked pretty tight. And this just upsets the apple cart less if you have less movement of people buying and selling houses, people moving in, then moving out because someone redeemed it back, and then now they got to sell it again. And all that constant movement, I figure, the way I look at this, is that the Lord was trying to make sure that Jerusalem, because remember, above all, Jerusalem is going to be a walled city. And I figure God's main reason for this law is that he does not want Jerusalem to become a transient city where people come and go. And there's all sorts of movement, disruption of Jerusalem city life. And of course, all of the other walled cities as well. Less disruption when there's people moving in and moving out. Okay, here's the new guy. The old guy sold the place. Now the new guy's in there. 3 years later, well, there goes the new guy, and here's the old guy again. He must have redeemed it. So the Lord, I believe, within walled cities, is wanting to disturb city life as little as possible and create the nearest thing to permanency and consistency within those walled cities as possible. And if I have that correct, and I do believe I do, if I have my reasoning correct, then that explains why the Lord would add this exception. Because number one, this discourages the sales of homes within the walled city. It discourages it. If you can sell that house and you just figure the financial hardship is temporary, give me a year or 2 or 5 and I'll bounce back and I'll get my house back, I'll get my property and possessions back. If that's the way you figure, it is less of a risk for you to sell a place in the country outside of a walled city. But if you're living in that house inside a walled city and you sell it, you've got yourself on a 1-year deadline. And if things don't take a major turn for you financially quickly within a year, then chances are you're losing that property permanently. That is going to discourage the sales of homes within a walled city. And number two, even if those sales do happen within the walled cities, it is going to lessen the movement of back and forth. This person moves in, then that person buys it, and then that person redeems it. And there's going to be a whole lot less of that because the way that the Lord figures it, I believe, is that the chances of a person being able to redeem that house back within a year are very slim. And that's going to lessen the amount of transient movement of person to person and family of family within the city. Chances are, more than likely, you're going to sell that house within the walled city. A year is going to pass, and it will become permanently the new owner's residence. Verse 31, however, the houses of villages which have no wall around them shall be counted as the fields of the country. They may be redeemed, and they shall be released in the Jubilee. So folks, Hank Williams Jr. was right. A country boy can survive. Country folk have this unwavering guarantee that if you sell a property, you don't just have a year. You have as much time as you need. You can buy that property back at any point. And if you can't afford to do it and you don't have a relative that can step in there and help you financially, you know that you're going to get it back after 1 generation. That's as long as it's going to stay in someone else's hand, and then it's coming right back to your family eventually. It's a good deal for the country folk. Worst case scenario, you lose it for that generation, but inevitably, eventually, it comes back into the family if you're not within a walled city. Verse 32, nevertheless, the cities of the Levites. So now we're talking about the priests. The cities of the Levites and the houses in the cities of their possession, the Levites may redeem at any time, verse 33. And if a man purchases a house from the Levites, then the house that was sold in the city of his possession shall be released in the Jubilee. For the houses in the cities of the Levites are their possession among the children of Israel, verse 34, but the field of the common land of their cities may not be sold, for it is their perpetual possession. The land laws for the priestly tribe, the tribe of Levi, they had to work differently because the Lord set this tribe up completely differently. The Levites were not allowed to individually own land. That's what verse 34 told us. Verse 34 stated that God had given a chunk of the land of Israel, and given that chunk of land, it was actually 48 cities specifically that he gave and designated to be land for the priests, the tribe of Levi. But it was land that could not be owned by them. It was just a shared common land for those tribes to live. Now, they could build their own houses and own their own houses because, of course, they have to live somewhere. And why not own what they build and what they make and what they pay money for? So, yes, they could own houses, but not the land on those houses, not the land under those houses. So that creates a bit of a problem when we're talking about these laws of redemption. If someone of the priestly tribe was forced to sell something in order to bounce back financially, they pretty much had just possessions, maybe family members that they could sell into slavery. We read about that in Exodus chapter 21, or their house. That's it. That's all they have. But they can't sell the land that goes with it because they don't own any of it. That is shared land for the priest. And pray tell, what would be the one reason why a priest, why anyone, why someone from the tribe of Levi would fall on hard times and have to sell their house? What would be the one reason? What do they do for a living? How do they make their money? They work in the sanctuary. These are ministry workers. And that's how they get their food. That's how they get their living. So the only way that a priest falls on hard times and gets into a situation where they are necessitated to sell that house would be if the people in the land weren't taking things seriously in the sanctuary, and people weren't showing up with their sacrifices, and people weren't bringing their tithes to the sanctuary. It's a terrible situation to even think that the sanctuary would become forsaken and that the priests would begin to starve and struggle financially. But it had happened in history, and it was possible to happen. And so the Lord does have to make it at least an exception that these priests can sell homes if they need to. Now, this is a problem in some churches, and I'm just so thankful that it's not a problem for this church. So I just want to publicly thank the Lord that you all here are so faithful at what you do for the Lord and how you give to the Lord. And you take this Anchored Fellowship Sanctuary very seriously. It is because of that faithfulness and that dedication to this sanctuary that we do all the things that we do every week here. Everything that we do at Anchored Fellowship, every meal that we have, every special event that we have, every service that we hold, we can do that the way that we're doing it because you guys take this seriously. And you bring your gifts and your tithes to the Lord, and you give it to the Lord and not to men and not to people. It really is true that once a church hits about 20 or 30 people, you can do the math, that church should be able to fully support a full-time pastor, 20 or 30 people. And yet, I know churches that are 70-plus members strong, and their pastor's bivocational. He's working another job. He's burning candles at both ends. Why? Well, I can't give you the exact reason for each one of them, but I just know that when the people of the sanctuary know what is required of them, and they take the sanctuary seriously, and they're dedicated to the Lord's work, and they're faithful in their giving and in their bringing, that's never going to be a problem where you're going to have a 100-member church that can't support a pastor. I feel bad for those churches in that situation, and I'm just so blessed and so grateful for each and every one of you for your dedication and your faithfulness. Anyway, back to the text. Like any house that was not within a walled city Levites could buy their homes back at any time, of course. The Lord does not want the priestly tribe dispossessed from their land, from their houses. So the Lord is going to make that as easy as possible for Levites to go ahead and redeem back those houses that they do sell. The Lord doesn't want anyone coming in there and doing a land grab and buying up a bunch of the priestly land. The Lord said in that verse that this land, this commonplace land, these 48 cities that were designated to the priest, it's a perpetual possession. If it has to leave, if a house has to leave priestly hands, let it only be for 50 years, and in the Jubilee, it's coming back because the Lord wants those priests to perpetually own that land as common land. Verse 35, if one of your brethren, a Jew, becomes poor and falls into poverty among you, then you shall help him like a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. Verse 36, take no usury or interest from him. Now, this is a little bit complicated because the word usury means interest. And you don't want to translate this to say, take no interest or interest from him. The Hebrew word here for interest should be the word increase or profit. So the better way to translate this would be to say, take no interest or profit from them. And that is exactly the way that the ESV translates that section of the verse. So A+ for the ESV translation there. Take no interest or profit from him, but fear your God, that your brother, that other Jew, may live with you. Verse 37, you shall not lend him your money for usury, for interest, nor lend him your food at a profit. You see, they got both of those words right that time in the New King James Version, interest and profit. So if a Jew needed to take in a poor Jew, sort of put them up for a while, give them housing and food, they were biblically allowed to charge that Jew whatever they needed to charge them in order to cover their costs. They could charge them for the food that they were eating. They could charge them for room and board, whatever that would equivalently cost them. They could charge them for any of the possessions that were being provided by that homeowner to that person that ended up poor and in need of assistance. But what you could not do is you were not allowed to charge another Jew interest on anything. Brand new 1500 Chariot, 12% APR. You were not allowed to charge interest, and you were not allowed to look at that other Jew with dollar signs in your eyes and say, now I could let this go at cost for such and such amount, but we can turn a profit here. We can make some money. Let's get the B&B going. Let's have a bed and breakfast. Let's charge extra for the food. We'll be sitting back and collecting profit. What the Lord doesn't want to happen, obviously, he doesn't want his people taking advantage of the less fortunate within the nation. They're flesh and blood. They are within the same lineage, and the Lord does not want to see that situation become a situation where advantage is being leveraged because of unfortunate circumstance of a person that fell out in a bad situation. And that's just really being a decent member of society, I think. It's pretty low when you start looking on down and out of luck brothers and sisters with dollar signs in your eyes. Oh man, I got them right where I want them. I got something they need, and they're gonna pay for it. Believe you me, I'm gonna put 20% right on the top, or I'm gonna charge an APR for every month you don't pay me back. I get 15% more. The Lord doesn't want us to be banks to those that are within our own borders and in genuine need. The Lord wants us to be able to be the kind of people where we would help them to get back up on their feet. Not, oh, Joe hit the rocks. Oh, we're gonna take advantage of this guy. We're gonna bilk him of what he does have left, and we're gonna turn a profit. None of that. Just be a decent human being within that community and help one another. When we're down, help one another get back up on their feet. I think that translates really well into church groups. I am always blessed to hear about the transactions that go on here in the fellowship. You know why? Because I always hear something similar to this: fellowship discount. I love that. I love to hear that. I was going to sell this for such and such an amount, but for you, church family discount, fellowship discount, I'm going to give it to you at cost. I'm not going to turn a profit on you. I love to hear those things because I think that's the right heart. I think that's the way we should be. There's just yet another reason to get saved and go to church. Church discount. You're going to get better deals from church people. That's just how it is. There's also that eternity thing. That's pretty big. But yeah, if you get saved, you're also going to be now inside. You're on the inside, and you're going to get the insider deals. I just recently had this happen to me not all that long ago. I was looking at something on Facebook Marketplace that I thought that I needed to buy. I really didn't, but I thought I did at the time. And I reached out to the guy and I said, hey, I know you're selling this for this certain amount. I'm just going to be honest with you. Here's what I think it's worth, and that's what I'm willing to pay. And I almost didn't send it because I felt bad. The guy was asking a lot of money. It was like a slap in the face, but I was being honest. That's what I would pay because that's what I felt like it was worth. And he wrote back and he was like, nah, sorry, it's worth this much. Okay, agree to disagree. Thank you for responding and see you later. Well, probably about 5 or 10 minutes later, I get another message from this guy and he goes, hey, I was checking out your Facebook profile. I see you're a pastor. And he said, you know what? I'm a Christian, and my dad was a pastor all my life, still is. He's something like 80-something years old. He's still pastoring. He goes, I tell you what, I'll sell it to you for that price. That price that you suggested, I'll sell it to you for. And of course, by then I had changed my mind and moved on, so I didn't buy it, but I just thought, wow, that was so nice of that guy. He saw that I was a Christian. I think it was more about that than the pastor thing. Usually being a pastor, when you tell someone that, it works against you. Oh, you're a pastor. Okay. But on those rare occasions, that sort of thing will benefit you. There should be a family discount among us. Let's not look at brothers and sisters. Let's learn from this text. Make it very practical. Let's not look at brothers and sisters with dollar signs in our eyes, Well, Paul, he's in this church with me. So I'm going to ask more, and he should want to pay that because he loves me. He's got to love me. So I should be able to get more out of Paul. No, we should be asking less of one another because we should want to bless one another. After all, Jesus said, it is more blessed to. Yeah, that's exactly what he said. And we struggle with that, but it is true. Verse 38, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. Verse 39, and if one of your brethren who dwells by you becomes poor and sells himself to you, so that is a Jew purchasing the labor of another Jew, all right? If that happens, if a Jew sells himself to you, sells his labor to you as a Jew, you shall not compel him to serve as a slave. Verse 40, as a hired servant and as a sojourner he shall be with you and shall serve you until the year of Jubilee. Verse 41, and then he shall depart from you, he and his children with him, and shall return to his own family. He shall return to the possession of his fathers. Verse 42, for they are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. Verse 43, you shall not rule over him with vigor, but you shall fear your God. So Jew should not be ruling over Jew with vigor. Because why? They just came out of that. Remember the Egyptians ruling over the Hebrews, ruling over the Jews with vigor? Yes, these are God's people. They've just come out of that very situation with Egypt. How much worse would it be if they allow the nation to devolve back into slavery, but slavery of the worst kind? Slavery where Jew is ruling over Jew. Jew owner controlling Jew slave. What a mess that would be. And the Lord says, nope, that is not going to happen. I have set you free, and I don't want you back under that kind of bondage. Solution: if a Jew is selling labor to you, do not consider them to be slaves. Don't treat them like slaves. You do not own them. Consider them to be co-workers. Consider them to be co-laborers. Consider them to be sojourners with you. Sojourners means temporarily dwelling with you. This is a temporary situation. And right when the year of Jubilee rolls around, those slaves, those Jewish slaves that aren't to be treated like slaves, those Jewish servants selling their labor to you, they're to be released back into the wild. They're to be set free. They're not to be grabbed onto as if you own them. It's to work differently within the nation. Verse 44, and as for your male and female slaves, whom you may have from the nations that are around you, so that is the Gentiles, from them you may buy male and female slaves. Verse 45, moreover, you may buy the children of the strangers who dwell among you and their families who are with you, which they beget in your land, and they shall become your property. Verse 46, and you may take them as an inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them as a possession. They shall be your permanent slaves. But regarding your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule over one another with vigor. So the Lord does not allow the Jews to have Jewish slaves. He wants that to look different and work different. And we have studied this topic before in Exodus chapter 21. I am counting on the fact that you guys remember some of that study or go back and revisit that study to get refreshed with it. Suffice it to say, the practice of slavery already existed in the world, and instead of the Lord banning the practice altogether, right up front, immediately, instead, the Lord chose to put initially strict regulations around the institution of slavery so that the entire institution of slavery would be more fair to all parties involved, including owners, including slaves. And one obvious reason why the Lord did that, instead of just bringing an abrupt and immediate halt to slavery, instead of doing it that way, choosing to regulate it instead, one of the reasons the Lord did that is mercy, grace. Because what happens if you just immediately call for an end of all slavery? What do? You displace the poor. Those that were slaves because that was their best financial option in life. That was the way that they could best make a living and provide for themselves. Well, you've just kicked them out with nothing. So if the Lord does that, if he brings an immediate and abrupt halt to slavery in the Old Testament law, then that is potentially a death sentence for many, many people. Because for many, many people, slavery was the best option that they had available to them. How do you stop a runaway train? Not abruptly. Because if you stop it abruptly, everyone on board is probably dead or injured. The way you stop a runaway train, as gradually as you need to. Doesn't matter how long it takes. If it takes 10 miles or 20 miles, however long it takes to stop that runaway train, that's how you do it. Because when it does stop, everyone on board is alive. And so I think the Lord kind of did the same thing with slavery. And I think the Lord chose, this is my opinion, and I believe it is biblical and supported by history, but I believe the Lord chose to gradually and gracefully stall out slavery through the vehicle of the church. I really believe that was the Lord's intention. That the Lord knew that once the gospel permeated a society and that society became prevalently Christian, that situation of slavery would take care of itself. It would fizzle out because there's Christians involved. Now, if you fast forward in the New Testament to the days of Paul talks about this issue of slavery, and he speaks to believers about slavery, and what does he essentially say to believers? If you're a slave, and now you're saved, deal with it. Don't try to cause an uproar. Don't try to break the mold. Don't try to get out of it because, oh, you're saved now. Paul says, if you're a slave and you're saved, then be a good saved slave because you're the Lord's free man. Remember Paul's statement about that? Now, if you're a free man, don't get too arrogant because you're still the Lord's slave. It works both ways. Paul is saying whatever calling you had in your life, whatever situation you were in your life, once you get saved, you just stick with that. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Just stick with where you are in life and do it as well as you can. And history tells us that anywhere that the gospel has prevailed and become permeated into that society, and once that society became a predominantly Christian society, then slavery ceased to exist. So I really believe that's what the Lord's plan was with slavery, to just gradually and gracefully phase it out, using the church as his vehicle to accomplish that. Now, just to cut the feet off of the potential controversy that we see in verses 44 through 46, the Jews could not take Jews as slaves, but God did allow the Jews to take non-Jews, Gentiles, as slaves. Why the partiality? The Jews were too good for slavery, but what, we Gentiles, we aren't? What's the deal? How could the Lord do this? How could he have a double standard for the Jews and the Gentiles? I'll give this to you in a statement. If you want to remember why, just write this statement down. It is better to be a slave in the kingdom than it is to be a free man outside the kingdom. Let me say that again. It is better to be a slave in the kingdom than it is to be a free man outside the kingdom. In other words, these are pagans. Their culture is pagan. Their culture is corrupt. Their lifestyle is corrupt. They have no good influences in those pagan societies that are worshiping abhorrent deities, false deities. And the Lord is saying, yes, of course, I feel good about bringing pagans out of those influences, bringing them into the nation as slaves, because they're going to be slaves to godly people. And they're out of the pagan culture now. They're in God's culture. They're getting fed well. They're not getting treated harshly like slaves. They're getting treated well because these are godly people. They're getting their needs met. They're getting fed. They're getting clothing and a roof over their head. They're getting all of those physical life needs met, and they're getting the influence of the kingdom of God in their lives. So no, the Lord's not giving the Gentiles, the pagans, the heathens, the short end of the stick. The Lord's giving the Gentiles this chance in a diminished role to get the foot in the door to the kingdom of God. And I like it. Personally, I'd rather be a slave in the kingdom than a free man outside of the kingdom. I just want to be where the Lord is, and I know you feel the same way. Verse 47, now if a sojourner or stranger close to you, so that's a Gentile friend that is sojourning in the land of Israel with you once they get to Canaan and it becomes Israel. If that Gentile friend becomes rich, and one of your brethren, a Jew, who dwells by him becomes poor and sells himself as a slave to the stranger or sojourner close to you, or to a member of the stranger's family, verse 48, after he is sold, he may be redeemed again. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle's son may redeem him, or anyone who is near of kin to him in his family may redeem him. Or if he is able, he may redeem himself. Verse 50, thus he shall reckon with him who bought him. The price of his release shall be according to the number of years. From the year that he was sold to him until the year of Jubilee, it shall be according to the time of a hired servant for him. 51, if there are still many years remaining, according to them he shall repay the price of his redemption from the money with which he was bought. Verse 52, And if there remain but a few years until the Jubilee, then he shall reckon with him, and according to his years he shall repay him the price of his redemption. He shall be with him as a yearly hired servant, and he shall not rule with vigor over him in your sight. And if he is not redeemed in these years, then he shall be released in the year of Jubilee, he and his children with him. Verse 55, for the children of Israel are servants to me. They are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So there's a lot of repetition here throughout all of these verses. And once you understand the basics of how these laws work, you can start to figure out how they funnel out and how they look in all these various different circumstances. And I think we're probably getting it by now. Verses 38 through 43, Jews weren't to sell themselves out as slaves to one another. And then verses 47 through 55, they shouldn't be selling themselves off as slaves to Gentiles either. But if they do, they do. I mean, none of this should happen. The Lord doesn't really want it to happen. But if it does, it does. Now you have a Jew that is a slave to a Gentile master in the land of Israel. And what the Lord does is he puts the Gentiles on notice here that if these Gentiles are living in the land of Israel, if they're like basically converting, they've proselytized and converted to, we would say, Judaism. If that happens, the Lord is saying, I expect those Gentiles to obey all of my laws. And that includes how they treat the Jews who sell themselves to them as Gentiles. So it effectively then sets this up for a, once again, temporary thing. All of the options for redemption are on the table. If you can get a family member to step in and redeem you out of that situation of slavery, wonderful. If not, the year of Jubilee is eventually going to roll around. And when that year of Jubilee does roll around on the morning of, on the day that it hits, all of those slaves are freed men and women. So hopefully all of that's clicking right now for you with how that works with slavery and all of that, Jews and Gentiles and Jews, the whole deal. What I want to do in closing here is just use our last few minutes together to come back to the laws of the Goel, since that's exactly what this chapter does. This chapter sort of scatters that law once it introduces it, scatters it through all of these various situations, and eventually ends on that note of the Goel as the closing note of the chapter. So let's do that. We're going to quickly run through the 4 basic requirements of a Goel, a redeeming relative, or a kinsman redeemer. And most importantly, as we do that, we are going to peer over into the spiritual side of things, and we're going to learn the spiritual truths that come from these laws of the Goel. And what really happens as we do that, when we look into the spiritual aspect of this, we see that these laws for the Goel actually serve as typologies for Christ. They promise Jesus. They predict Jesus. They reveal Jesus to us. When it comes to redeeming people out of sin, Jesus fulfills every one of the requirements of these laws of the Goel. Ultimately, folks, Jesus is our Goel. He is our redeeming relative. He's our kinsman redeemer. That is why we don't just read the book of Ruth as a literal book. I actually just did that today at 3 p.m. I read the whole book of Ruth, every bit of it. It's only 4 chapters. And we don't read that as just a love story between Ruth and Boaz, do we? Because of these laws of the Goel, and because of how we interpolate those and extrapolate those into New Testament truth, New Testament doctrine, it causes us to read the book of Ruth completely differently, because we read it with all of that rich typology in mind. And when you do that, the story changes drastically. Ruth now is not just Ruth, a woman, but Ruth is the representative for us. And Boaz, he's not just a guy, not just a family member, But Boaz represents Christ to us, and it becomes not just a love story between Ruth, who lucked out with Boaz, or maybe Boaz who lucked out with Ruth. They probably argue that. Becomes more than that. It becomes a love story about us individually and our Lord. So here are the 4 basic requirements of a goel. Number 1, a goel would have to be related by blood. So a near family member. And what that does is that begins to paint a picture, a portrait of Jesus. We needed someone eligible to redeem us out of our slavery to sin. And there was only one person. We're going to talk about the requirements of that in a sec, but there was only one. I don't want to say person. There was only one being that was qualified to be our redemption. But big problem. It was God. And God is not a near kin to us. He's not flesh and blood to us. God doesn't even have blood. Blood is a human thing. So there's God in heaven, the only one qualified to save us, to redeem us, to buy us back out of our slavery. But he's not related to us. He's not flesh and blood. So if you ever ask the question, why is it that the incarnation of Jesus had to happen? Why did Jesus, being God, have to set aside his divinity, Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11. Why did he have to do that? Become incarnated. Incarnate means in the flesh. Why did he incarnate in flesh and blood? Why did he have to do that to save us? Well, it is because as part of God's rules for justice, for fairness, and to meet the righteous demands of his law, it would have to be a representative of us to redeem us. It had to be one of us. And that was why it was necessary for Christ to set aside his divinity, those divine prerogatives, step into human flesh through virgin birth, to be family with us, flesh and blood with us, a near kinsman to us, so that he could be qualified in God's eyes by God's righteous standards of justice to step in then and redeem us. So for point number 1, you would want to write down Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11. Jesus had to become flesh and blood with us in order to save us through his blood. And if you really think about it, he didn't just step into our family. What he did was he stepped into our fallen family to become flesh and blood with us. Now, through his virgin birth, of course, there was no corruption in him. He didn't inherit the sin nature, but he stepped into this fallen family of flesh and blood to redeem flesh and blood through his blood. Number 2, in order to be a goel, a redeeming relative, that relative had to be free himself. A slave could not redeem another slave. You know, like 2 slaves working away, laboring away, trying to make back money. That one slave finally gets enough money, and instead of redeeming himself, he redeems a family member. You could not do that. You had to be a free man redeeming a slave. Now, in spiritual terms, that's a big deal. Because that would mean that in order for us sinners to be redeemed out of our sin, we would need someone to rise up as our redeeming relative who was not slave to sin. And we know that slavery to sin isn't just because of sinful actions. It's by nature and by birth. So whoever is going to redeem us as fallen human beings, they're going to have to be flesh and blood. They're going to have to be part of this family, but they cannot be born with a sinful nature. And they have to live their entire life until that moment of redemption without sin. Well, you all know no one was ever capable of that until the virgin gave birth. And he was not born with a sinful nature. He got that from his father's side, his heavenly father's side. He was born perfect. Greater yet, He lived 33 years on this earth, walking the same dirt we do, facing the same temptations as we do, in all points, tempted as we are, and yet he was without sin. So he qualifies as the righteousness that we needed. He's flesh and blood now, Christ on the earth in our skin, and now he can be our Goel in the first two categories. Category number 3, a redeeming relative had to be able to pay the full price for the redemption. You may have been a close relative that had the desire to help, but if you didn't have the funds, then that person in need of redemption was as hopeless without you as they were, as hopeless with you as they were without you. You had to be able to pay the full price. In spiritual terms, it would mean that our redeeming relative would need to be able to pay for the price of every sin ever committed. Every sin ever committed. The kind of righteousness that would be required to offset that much unrighteousness, all of our unrighteousness, from the first sin to the last sin that's committed. That kind of righteousness that would be required to offset all of this world's unrighteousness is unfathomable, and yet Jesus himself qualified in that his righteousness was the same righteousness as God the Father in heaven, though he was in our skin. Amazing, right? He met that requirement without even breaking a sweat. I would point you to Revelation chapter 5, and we did a study on that not all that long ago. Revelation chapter 5. Who was worthy to take the scroll and redeem the whole earth out of its sin? Only one. Only Jesus was worthy. Number 4, a redeeming relative had to do so willingly. One of the most important parts to me. You could not force near of kin to redeem you. You couldn't coerce them. You couldn't guilt trip them into it. Maybe some Italian mothers could. You weren't supposed to. You couldn't guilt trip or coerce or compel a near family member to redeem and bail you out on your people, property, and possessions. It had to be willing. Actually, if you go to that story of Ruth, you should probably read that book later. Ruth chapter 3, verse 12. I don't know if you knew this or not, but in Ruth chapter 3, verse 12, we find out that Boaz was not the closest family member to Ruth. There was actually one person, one man that was a closer relative than Boaz was. So in chapter 3, verse 12, Boaz tells that to Ruth. He says, I got to check with this guy first. He gets first dibs on redeeming your land and on marrying you. He gets first dibs on it. So chapter 4, that's what that whole chapter is about. It's about Boaz checking with that family member. He goes to that family member and he says, hey, there's this gal, Ruth. She's part of the family. You're first in line. You're nearest of kin. So this is your opportunity if you want it. Would you like to redeem the land? No joke. Read this for yourself. Would you like to redeem the land? And this guy goes, yes. Yes, definitely. Interested. Very interested. I'll redeem the land. And he goes, oh, also, by the way, there's a wife that goes along with it. And immediately the guy says, I'm out. That's all yours, Boaz. I'm out. If it was just land, I'm in. If it's just a bad situation for me, nope, I can't do it. Have at it, Boaz. And then Boaz steps in, not as the closest family member, but once that closest family member willfully rejected, he then, Boaz, steps in and redeems Ruth's land and marries Ruth. Beautiful story, absolutely beautiful story. And it shows us the necessity of the willingness to redeem in that situation. And when you read that book of Ruth, it's all about these laws of the Goel. Beautiful, beautiful book, beautiful story that you should read. And folks, I want you to know, Jesus, he was eligible to be our Redeemer, our kinsman Redeemer, our Goel. He was qualified to be it But the best part of all, number 3, he was willing to be our Goel. He was willing to be our Redeemer. Jesus willingly laid down his life for us, and I would feel bad if it was any other way, wouldn't you? If God said, Jesus, get down there. Work to do. I love those people. You're going to go down. You're going to shed your blood and die for them. And what if Jesus didn't want to do that? What if he was not willing? The Gospels would read very differently, wouldn't they? Like the parables of Jesus, it'd be like Jesus depressed. Well, if a shepherd has 99 sheep, but that one stupid and stubborn sheep runs off, you have to go get him because that's what you have to do. You're forced to do it, so I got to go running. I got to take care of this knucklehead that probably ran off a second and third time too. But instead, when you read the Gospels, they're not depressed and I have to, so I did. And he was not compelled. He was not coerced. He was not forced. Instead, this is the way that the Gospels read. John chapter 10, verses 14, 15, and 18. Jesus said, I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep, and am known by my own. As the Father knows me, even so I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself willingly. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again. This command I received from my Father. So the Lord, he's the Boaz of the story. He steps in as our near of kin, our next of kin. He's eligible. He's flesh and blood. He's qualified. He's perfect. But he's also willing, because his heart is in love with us. Let's stand.